Steve's father stood from his chair without a word. He walked to the sideboard, picked up a sealed white envelope, and slid it across the dinner table until it stopped an inch from my plate. "I think we should settle this before the wedding," he said. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone already suspects what's about to happen and nobody wants to be the one who says it out loud. Emily's eyes moved from the envelope to me, her smile fading by degrees. Steve leaned back in his chair, arms folded, wearing the kind of confident half-smile that only shows up on people who believe they've already won before the conversation has started. His mother lifted her wine glass and watched me with polite, unhurried curiosity, the way you'd watch a chess opponent you weren't especially worried about. I looked down. My name wasn't on the envelope. Neither was Emily's. There was a single word printed neatly across the front. Family. And sitting there, in my old brown coat with the mended sleeve, surrounded by people who had spent the entire dinner deciding I had nothing left to offer anyone, I realized Stacy had been right all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Richard Walker. I'm 72 years old, and for most of the people who meet me, that's already enough information to draw a conclusion. They see a man in a 20-year-old pickup truck. They see a coat with a mended sleeve and boots that have been resold twice. They see me drinking black coffee alone at the same diner every Saturday morning, and they decide, without ever asking, that they know my whole story. They're wrong, but I've never gone out of my way to correct them. What almost nobody outside my closest circle knows is that I spent 41 years in the United States Army, and I retired as a 4-star general. Most officers who reach that rank retire well before the 40-year mark, but I stayed longer than most, and there's a quiet provision in military law that rewards that. A small number of 3- and 4-star officers who serve beyond 40 years draw a pension that runs higher than what they earned on active duty. Mine comes out to a little over $19,700 a month. My house has been paid off for 2 decades. My late wife Stacy and I built a modest fortune slowly, carefully. The way people do when they've seen what happens to families who chase money instead of building something that lasts. I've never advertised any of it. Stacy used to say something to me every year, usually while she was wrapping presents at the kitchen table humming to herself. "Richard," she'd say, "if you ever want to know a person's real character, let them believe you have nothing. Watch what they do when they think there's nothing to gain from you." I thought she was just being Stacy, thoughtful, a little poetic, always turning ordinary moments into small lessons. It took me years after she passed to understand she'd handed me one of the most useful tools I'd ever own. 6 years ago, I lost her to cancer. I still keep her cookie jar on the kitchen counter. I still park in the same spot at the same diner. And I still wear that old brown coat, even though I could buy 100 new ones without touching my savings. Now, I should tell you what those 41 years actually looked like, because it matters, and because what happened later at that dinner table would have gone very differently if the people sitting across from me had bothered to find out. I didn't start out a general. I started out an 18-year-old private from a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, carrying a duffel bag and a fear I never admitted to anyone. I made rank slowly, the way most people actually do it, not the way it looks in movies. I spent years in places I still can't talk about at dinner parties. I buried friends. I wrote letters to families I'd never met, trying to find words that didn't exist for what I needed to tell them. I made decisions in rooms where the wrong call cost lives, and I carried every one of those decisions home with me, whether I wanted to or not. By the time the 4th star came, I'd stopped being impressed by rank. I'd seen too many people wear it like a costume, and too many others earn something quieter and more permanent, the kind of respect that doesn't need a uniform to be recognized. Stacy used to say the Army taught me everything I needed to know about people except how to slow down and enjoy having survived it. She wasn't wrong about that either. When I finally retired, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt tired and grateful and increasingly uninterested in anything that resembled status. That's the part people rarely understand about men and women who've spent decades in genuine positions of consequence. Once you've held real weight, the fake kind stops interesting you. A watch, a car, a coat. None of it moves the needle anymore. What moves the needle is whether the people around you are honest, whether they treat a stranger the same way they treat someone who can do something for them, and whether they'd still show up for you if you had absolutely nothing to offer in return. That's the lens I carried into that dinner. Not suspicion, exactly, just decades of trained observation that I'd never quite figured out how to switch off, even in retirement. So when my daughter Emily called and asked if I'd come to dinner with her fiancé's parents, a few months before the wedding, I said yes before she'd even finished the invitation. "It would mean a lot to him, Dad," she said. "Steve wants both families together before things get official. He wants everyone comfortable with each other." That sounded reasonable. It also sounded like something Steve would say when what he really meant was something else entirely. I didn't tell Emily that. I'd learned a long time ago that some things are better observed than argued about. I'd noticed changes in Steve over the 18 months he and Emily had been together. Nothing loud. Nothing anyone could point to and call cruelty. Just a slow drift. He'd started judging restaurants by whether they had valet parking. He complimented watches more than he complimented people. He spoke to waiters in one voice and to potential business contacts in another. And the difference between those two voices told me everything I needed to know about a man's character, whether he realized it or not. Whenever he visited my house, he'd glance around the living room the way you glance at something you're too polite to comment on directly. The furniture that had outlived 2 decades of trends. The same recliner Stacy used to fall asleep in during football games. He never said anything unkind. He didn't have to. Quiet disappointment has its own language, and I've spent enough time reading soldiers' faces to know when someone is disguising judgment as politeness. Emily either didn't see it or she didn't want to. I understood both possibilities. Love has a way of editing what we're willing to notice. The evening of the dinner, I stood in front of my closet for a long moment, and then I reached past 3 coats that were newer, warmer, and objectively nicer, and I pulled out the old brown one. The zipper had been replaced years earlier. The elbows were thin in a way that told you exactly how many winters it had survived. Stacy used to joke that I'd probably be buried in it. I smiled at the thought, put it on, and got into my truck. I want to be honest about why I did it. It wasn't spite. It wasn't some elaborate test designed to trap anyone. I simply wanted to see, one more time, how people treat a man they believe has nothing left to offer them. Stacy's lesson. Still working. 6 years after she stopped being here to say it out loud. And what happened at that dinner, well, it changed everything. But not in the way anyone at that table expected. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The drive took about 35 minutes, and somewhere along the way, the modest neighborhoods gave way to wide streets lined with brick homes, trimmed hedges, and driveways that seemed to have been designed specifically to be photographed. Steve's parents lived in a beautiful house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, not showy, just clearly, comfortably successful. Emily met me at the door and hugged me the way she'd hugged me since she was small enough to wrap both arms around one of my legs. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "So am I." I told her, and I meant it. Steve appeared a moment later, all easy smile and firm handshake. "Richard," he said. He always called me Richard. Never Dad. Never Mr. Walker. I'd never corrected him. Some things aren't worth the argument, and I was more interested in what a man's habits revealed than in forcing him to perform respect he didn't feel. His eyes moved briefly to my coat. "You know it's supposed to drop into the 30s tonight." "I've been cold before," I said. "You should let Emily get you something decent. My mom knows a guy who does custom outerwear." Emily's cheeks colored slightly. "Dad likes that coat." Steve laughed, easy and unbothered. "Well, everyone deserves an upgrade eventually. So I've heard," I said, and let it go. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. Family photos lined the hallway, ski trips, graduations. A boy who'd clearly grown up believing that good things simply arrived when you were patient enough to wait for them. Steve's mother greeted me with the kind of polished warmth you learn at country clubs. His father shook my hand firmly, and I noticed something the rest of the room missed. His eyes stayed on my face. Not my coat. Not the truck I'd parked at the curb, visible through the front window, sitting beside two SUVs that cost more than some houses. Just my face, like he was reading something rather than assessing something. I filed that detail away and said nothing. We sat down at a long table set with more care than the occasion strictly required, and the conversation moved the way conversations move in rooms where everyone has always had enough. Vacation homes. A new boat someone was considering. A cousin's wine collection. I listened more than I spoke, which has always been my instinct in unfamiliar rooms, and which 41 years of briefings and debriefs had turned into something closer to a discipline than a habit. At one point, Steve told a story about a coworker who was, in his words, still renting an apartment at 42. I told him, Steve said, grinning around the table, if you're still broke by the time you're supposed to be comfortable, you probably made bad decisions your whole life. A few polite chuckles went around the table. Someone nodded like he'd said something wise. Retirement should be comfortable, Steve added, glancing my way, if people actually plan for it. Planning matters, I agreed, and cut another piece of chicken. Now, if you've ever sat at a table where someone was quietly judging everything about you without saying it directly, I want you to comment the word coat below. Trust me, what's coming next made every one of those comments worth enduring. At one point, Steve's mother asked me, with genuine-sounding curiosity, what I'd done for a career. I told her I'd spent most of my life in government service, which was true, if incomplete. She nodded politely and moved on to a story about a friend's timeshare in Aspen, and I understood, in that small moment, exactly how little space I'd been given in her imagination. To her, I wasn't a man with a history worth asking follow-up questions about. I was a category. The aging father-in-law who'd be quietly managed, accommodated, seated at the end of the table during holidays, and otherwise not thought about too deeply. I'd met that assumption before, in different rooms, wearing different coats. It never stopped being interesting to watch it form in real time. His mother turned to me with an expression I recognized immediately, sympathy dressed up as concern, the kind people offer when they've already decided what category you belong in. It must be difficult, she said gently, living on a fixed income these days. Emily shifted in her chair. Before I could open my mouth, Steve answered for me. Richard manages, he said. Manages, an interesting word to choose. I smiled, because I hadn't come to that table to defend myself. I'd come to watch. Stacy's voice was steady in the back of my mind. Let them believe you have nothing. Dessert came. Coffee followed. The conversation slowed into the kind of lull that settles over a table once everyone has said the easy things and is beginning to wonder what comes next. Then Steve's father stood, walked to the sideboard without a word, and came back holding a sealed white envelope. He set it down and slid it across the table until it stopped an inch from my plate. I picked it up. The paper had weight to it. Legal paper. The kind that's been folded by someone who does this often enough to have a system. I think you'll understand why this is necessary, Steve said. His voice stayed calm, but there was pride running underneath it, the kind that fills a room whether you want it to or not. I didn't answer him. I opened the envelope instead, and everyone at that table watched me do it. Inside was a stack of legal documents. Before I'd read past the first line, Steve's father added, quietly, please read everything. I nodded. I'd spent 41 years opening envelopes that mattered, mission briefings before sunrise, casualty notifications that would end up changing a family's life forever, delivered in an envelope not so different from this one. Promotion orders, retirement papers, the ones that closed out a career and opened up a life I hadn't fully learned how to live yet. Compared to those, an envelope at a family dinner should have been nothing. But something in the faces around that table told me this piece of paper was going to change more than one life before the night was over. I turned to the first page. It read, Premarital Property Agreement. For 2 full minutes, nobody spoke. The only sound in that dining room was the quiet turning of paper. What I found in those pages made me realize this dinner was never about welcoming me into the family. It was about making sure I understood exactly where my daughter stood in theirs. And what I did next? Well, nobody at that table saw it coming. I didn't sign anything. I didn't argue, either. I read every page carefully, the way I'd been trained to read anything that mattered. And then I closed the folder, slid the papers back inside the envelope, and folded my hands on the table. Nobody seemed to know what to make of my silence. Steve looked almost amused by it. "I'm sure you understand," he said. "It's standard these days, honestly. It's not personal." His mother nodded along. "We're only trying to protect what our family has worked so hard to build." I looked at her, and I meant every word of what I said next. I believe every family should protect what they've worked for. Relief crossed Steve's face instantly. He thought I'd just agreed with him. His father, though, never relaxed. He kept studying me the way he had since the handshake at the door, like a man who suspected there was a piece of information the rest of the room was missing. Emily stared into her coffee cup, and I could almost hear something breaking quietly inside her. She'd always hated conflict, hated it since she was a little girl, the kind of child who'd rather give up her turn on the swing than argue about whose turn it actually was. Watching her like that pulled me back to a Christmas years earlier, when she was 8 years old and Stacy was still alive. That year, Emily had wanted the newest bicycle in the neighborhood, the one every friend of hers seemed to already own. Bright paint, gears, the whole thing. Money was never the obstacle. Stacy and I could have bought her 3 of them without blinking. Instead, Stacy found an older bike at a church sale. Scratched frame, crooked basket, faded paint. Emily's face fell the moment she unwrapped it. Stacy knelt down next to her and said something I've never forgotten. "This bike," she told Emily, "already knows how to be loved. It's been ridden hard, and it's still standing. That means something." Emily rode that bicycle every single day for 3 years. By the time she outgrew it, the scratches didn't bother her anymore. She'd stopped seeing them as damage and started seeing them as proof the bike had been worth having. I don't know if Stacy was teaching Emily something that day, or teaching me. Maybe both. Sitting at that dinner table decades later, watching my daughter stare into a coffee cup while a stranger's envelope sat between us, I understood the lesson all over again. Some people look at wear and see brokenness. Others look at wear and see a life that's actually been lived. "Dad?" Emily's voice was quiet, careful, the way she used to sound as a kid when she was about to ask something she was scared of the answer to. "Are you okay with this?" I looked at her, and then at the envelope, and then, finally, at Steve. "Can I ask you something first?" I said. Steve spread his hands, still wearing that easy, confident smile. "Of course." "When you asked Emily to marry you," I said, "did you ask her because of what she has, or because of who she is?" The smile faltered, just slightly. "Because of who she is." "Obviously, good," I said. "Then I have a question for your father." I turned to him. He met my eyes without flinching, and I respected that. Whatever else was coming. "This agreement," I said, tapping the folder, "protects your family's assets from my daughter. Is there anything in here that protects her from anything?" The table went quiet in a different way now, not the anticipatory quiet from before, but something more uncertain. "It's a standard mutual agreement," Steve's father said carefully. "Then you won't mind if I read it that way," I said, and I opened the folder again, this time turning to the clauses near the back instead of the front. I've read enough contracts in 4 decades of military and post-military life to know that the truth of a document usually hides in the language everyone assumes nobody will bother reading. What I found confirmed what I'd already suspected. The agreement protected Steve's family's assets, a trust, a portion of a business, several properties, from any claim by Emily in the event of a divorce. It said nothing, anywhere, about what would happen to her in that same scenario. Nothing about spousal support. Nothing about her giving up her own career trajectory to support his, which I already knew she'd quietly begun considering. Nothing that treated her as anything other than a risk to be managed. I set the folder down and looked at Steve directly for the first time all evening. "You said this protects family," I said. "I'm asking which family." Nobody answered right away. Emily's eyes were wet, and I watched her realize, in real time at her own engagement dinner, that the man she loved had let his family draft a document that treated her like a liability rather than a partner, and that he'd been prepared to let her sign it without a second thought. Steve's confidence, which had filled the room so easily an hour earlier, started to slip. "It's not, I didn't mean it like that," he said. "It's just business. It's how these things are done." "I spent 41 years around how things are done," I said. "I learned that the phrase usually shows up right before someone asks you to accept something you shouldn't." His father cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, I don't think you fully understand the position our family is." "I understand it completely," I said, and I meant it kindly, not sharply. "You've built something over a lifetime, and you're afraid of losing pieces of it. That's not an unreasonable fear. I felt it myself." I paused. "But you built a document to protect assets, and you never once asked what it would take to protect my daughter." Silence again, the third kind of the evening, the kind that has nowhere left to hide. And then I said something that changed the entire room. Because up until that moment, every person at that table still believed they were sitting across from a retired government worker in a worn-out coat. They had no idea who I actually was. And they were about to find out. "There's something else you should know," I said, and I felt, for the first time all night, the old weight of command settle back into my shoulders, not aggressive, just certain. "You've spent this entire dinner treating me like a man who has nothing to bring to this family. I'd like to correct that. Not because it changes anything about tonight's conversation, but because I think it's time the table had accurate information before anyone signs anything." I told them. 41 years in the Army. 4 stars. A pension over $19,700 a month, thanks to a rarely used provision that rewards the small number of senior officers who serve past the 40-year mark. A paid-off house, a portfolio Stacy and I built over decades of discipline neither of us ever talked about at dinner parties. The room changed instantly. Steve's mother set down her wine glass slowly, like it had suddenly become heavier. Steve himself went very still, his mouth slightly open, running back through every comment he'd made about my coat, my truck, the word manages. His father, to his credit, was the only one who didn't look surprised. "I suspected there was more to you than the coat," he said quietly. "I've negotiated with enough people to know when someone in the room is holding more than they're showing." "Your father's a smart man," I said to Steve. "You should listen to him more." Steve's father leaned back slowly in his chair, studying me with an expression that had shifted from wariness into something closer to respect. 4 stars, he said, almost to himself. "Do you mind if I ask what that actually involved? I've read about rank structures, but I've never sat across from someone who lived it." It wasn't the question I expected, and I think that surprised both of us. "It involved a lot of nights I don't talk about," I said honestly, "and a level of responsibility that doesn't leave you, even after you take the uniform off. When you've had to make decisions that decide whether people come home to their families, a premarital agreement over a beach house starts to look like a very small thing." He absorbed that in silence for a moment. "I built my business from nothing," he said finally, quieter than before. "Started with a used truck and a line of credit I nearly defaulted on twice. I think I've spent so many years afraid of losing what I built that I forgot to ask whether I was protecting it from the right threats." He glanced at his son. "You weren't the threat tonight, General. I think I was." It was the most honest thing anyone had said all evening, and it changed the temperature of the room more than anything I'd said myself. "I'm not upset that you wanted an agreement," I told them, once the shock had settled enough for anyone to hear me clearly. "Protecting what you've built isn't wrong. What troubles me is that nobody in this room thought to protect my daughter the same way. That tells me something about how this marriage is being built before it's even begun." Emily reached over and took my hand under the table. I felt her fingers shaking slightly, and I gave them a gentle squeeze. "I don't want money from your family," I said to Steve's father. "I don't need it, and even if I did, that's not what tonight is about. What I want is simple. If you're going to protect this family with paper, protect all of it. Rewrite this agreement so it treats my daughter as an equal partner, not a risk. And Steve," I turned to him, "I want you to think very seriously about whether you were marrying Emily or marrying the idea of controlling what she might one day be worth to you." Steve's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought pride was going to win the way it usually does with young men who've never had to sit with genuine humility. But something in his face shifted instead. He looked at Emily, really looked at her, the way I hadn't seen him look at her all evening, and something in him seemed to crack open just slightly. "I didn't think about it that way," he said quietly. This is what my parents did before their wedding. I never questioned it." "That's the problem with inherited habits," I said. "Nobody questions them until somebody makes them look at the paper directly." The dinner ended quietly after that. No shouting, no dramatic exits, just people sitting with an uncomfortable new understanding of themselves, which, in my experience, tends to do more good in the long run than any argument ever could. Emily rode home with me that night instead of leaving with Steve. Nobody suggested it out loud. She simply climbed into the passenger seat of my truck, still wearing her coat, and didn't say anything until we were several miles down the road. "I didn't know," she said finally. "About the agreement. He never showed it to me before tonight." "I believe you," I said. "I'm so embarrassed, Dad. Don't be." I kept my eyes on the road. "You didn't write that document. You didn't choose the words in it. The only thing you're responsible for is what you do now that you've seen it clearly." She was quiet for a long stretch after that, watching the brick houses give way to more familiar streets, more familiar porch lights. "Do you think he's a bad person?" she finally asked, and I could hear how much the answer mattered to her. "No," I said honestly. "I think he's a young man who's never had to examine the water he's been swimming in. That's different from being bad. It just means he's had it easier than he realizes, and easier isn't always better for building character." "What do I do?" "You watch," I said. "Not to punish him. Just to see what he does with tonight, now that he knows you saw it too. People show you who they are in the days after they've been caught off guard, not in the moment itself. Anyone can look good with no pressure on them. It's what happens after the pressure that tells you the truth." She reached over and squeezed my hand on the gear shift, the same way she used to when she was small and riding beside me on long drives to visit her grandparents. "I love you, Dad," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you wore that coat tonight." I smiled, even though she couldn't quite see it in the dark. "So am I," I said. "Your mother would have liked how tonight went. Not the envelope part, the part where the truth finally got a chance to sit at the table. Now most stories like this end right there. The villain gets exposed, the hero goes home, and everybody moves on. But what happened next surprised even me, because Steve did the one thing I honestly wasn't sure he was capable of. He changed, and the way he did it taught me something about forgiveness I'm still thinking about today. 3 days later, my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail, not out of anger, but because I wanted whoever was calling to have had enough time to actually think before we spoke again. It was Steve. "Hi, Dad," he said, and something in his voice was different, smaller, more honest. That was the first time he'd ever called me that. "Good morning," I said. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not. Could I stop by? Just me. I don't want Emily to come." That surprised me. "Why not?" "Because this conversation is between us." I looked out the kitchen window at the old maple tree Stacy had planted the year we bought the house. "I'll put coffee on," I told him. An hour later, his SUV sat in my driveway beside my old truck, and he walked up carrying 2 paper bags, breakfast sandwiches and coffee from the diner I visit every Friday. "I figured you'd appreciate something familiar," he said. "I do." We sat at my kitchen table for a long while before either of us touched the food. "I haven't slept much," he finally said. "I imagine you haven't." "I keep replaying that dinner. So have I." He looked around my kitchen, the old cabinets, the worn wooden table, Stacy's cookie jar still sitting where it had sat for 30 years. "I've spent 3 years assuming you lived this way because you had no choice," he said. "Now I think you chose it. On purpose." "I did." "Why?" I got up, walked into the hallway, and came back with a faded photograph. Stacy and me, standing in front of the first house we ever owned. 1,200 square feet, paint that needed work, a porch that leaned slightly to one side. We looked happier in that picture than 2 people had any reasonable right to look. I handed it to him. "That house cost us everything we had at the time." He studied it. "You look young." I was. "You look happy." I was. "What happened?" "We paid it off. Built a life." Earned more than we ever imagined we would. I paused. And we realized something important along the way. We were never happier than we were in that picture, standing in front of a house that cost us everything and gave us more than money ever could. He was quiet for a long moment. So, after you retired, you stopped chasing things. I started protecting peace instead, I said. There's a difference. Chasing things fills a house. Protecting peace fills a life. He stared into his coffee cup the way Emily had stared into hers 3 nights earlier. I think I've been chasing the wrong finish line, he said. Maybe running someone else's race without ever asking if it was actually mine. I let that sentence sit between us. Sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone is silence, right after they've said something true. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. I couldn't help smiling. I'm starting to think envelopes just follow you around. He laughed. A real laugh. Not the polished one from the dinner table. I probably deserve that. Inside was the original premarital agreement. Every page had a large diagonal stamp across it now. Void. I asked the attorney to destroy the original, he said. This is just the copy. I wanted you to see it. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said. I wanted to. He hesitated. Emily and I met with a different attorney last week. We're drafting new documents, ones that protect both of us equally, not just my family's assets. That sounds fair, I said. There's something else in there too, he added. What's that? A charitable foundation, he said, for veterans, and for military families dealing with long deployments. He looked almost nervous saying it, like he wasn't sure it would land the way he hoped. It landed. I felt something rise in my throat that took me a moment to push back down. Stacy would have loved that, I said. Winter faded into spring, and during those months I watched something happen in Steve that I don't think even he expected. Real change is rarely dramatic. It doesn't usually arrive as one tearful conversation and a complete transformation. It shows up in small, repeated choices, the kind nobody's watching closely enough to notice unless they're paying real attention. The wedding was postponed by 4 months, not because anyone demanded it, but because Steve asked for the time himself. I want to earn this marriage, he told Emily, not just plan it. She agreed, and I respected him for asking. During those months, he started coming with me to the VA hospital once a month, something I'd been doing quietly for years, long before Emily had even met him. The first visit, he barely spoke. He told me afterward he hadn't known what to say to the men and women in those rooms, people who'd given years, limbs, friends, and sometimes their peace of mind for something bigger than themselves. You don't have to say anything, I told him. Just listen. So he did. He listened to a man who still carried guilt from something that happened 20 years earlier and had never told his own children about it. He listened to a woman who'd spent 3 birthdays overseas and still couldn't watch fireworks without flinching. He listened to an army medic who couldn't stop talking about a little girl in Afghanistan he'd treated once and never stopped thinking about. But there was one visit in particular that changed everything, and I don't think either of us will ever forget it. An old sergeant named Willis, a man who'd lost most of his hearing in an explosion decades earlier and rarely got visitors anymore, spent nearly an hour telling Steve about a Christmas he'd spent in a hospital bed in Germany, unable to call home because the phone lines were down. Steve sat with him the entire time, leaning in close so Willis could read his lips, never once checking his watch or glancing toward the door the way I'd watched him do at business dinners before. When we finally left, Steve sat in the passenger seat for a long time without starting the car. He said nobody's asked him about that Christmas in 11 years, Steve said eventually. 11 years, and I'm the first person who just let him finish the story. He shook his head. I used to think being generous meant writing a check. I don't think I understood, until today, that it mostly just means showing up and staying long enough to listen. That sentence told me more about the man my daughter had chosen than any envelope ever could. He changed in smaller ways too, the kind that told me more than the big gestures ever could. He started calling his grandmother every Sunday, not just on holidays. At the diner, he learned the name of the waitress who'd once spilled water on his sleeve during an early, awkward dinner with Emily and me, Martha, and after that, he greeted her by name every single time. whether anyone was watching or not. One afternoon, I saw him help an elderly stranger load groceries into his car outside the pharmacy. No one was filming it. No one was going to hear about it later. He just did it, and then he got back into his car and drove away like it hadn't been anything worth mentioning. That was the moment I knew his apology had turned into something real. Character was never going to be proven by one emotional conversation at my kitchen table. It gets proven in the ordinary moments after everyone stops watching. The ones nobody's around to grade you on. The wedding finally happened on a warm Saturday in late spring. Emily didn't choose the expensive country club Steve's family had originally suggested. She chose a small white church that Stacy had loved for years, the kind of place with creaky wooden pews and stained glass that had needed repair since before I retired. Fresh flowers lined the aisle. Neighbors filled the seats. Veterans from my old unit sat beside Steve's business partners, and for once, nobody in that room seemed to care who had more money than who. Everyone was just there to watch two people begin something together. That morning, I reached for my suit, and then, almost without thinking, I glanced at the hook beside it, where my old brown coat still hung. I picked it up and carried it out to the car with me, not because I needed it in the May warmth, but because it reminded me of Stacy, and of a dinner table where an envelope had almost defined a marriage before it started, and of the quiet lesson that appearances rarely tell the whole story. When I arrived at the church, Steve spotted me from across the parking lot and walked straight over. Before either of us said a word, he pulled me into a hug, a real one, not the polite handshake from that first dinner. The kind of hug that belongs to family. He stepped back, grinning. I almost forgot, he said. Forgot what? He reached into the inside pocket of my coat, and I felt something small and hard land in his palm. He held it up. My old military field watch, the one I'd stopped wearing years ago because the movement had finally given out. I had it cleaned, he said. And repaired. I turned it over. The scratches were still there. The numbers were still faded in the same places they'd always been faded. Only the inside had changed. It still looks old, I said. It should, he said, smiling. That's the whole point. Thank you, I told him. He shook his head. No, thank you, Dad. His eyes were bright, and for the first time in 3 years, the word landed exactly the way it was meant to. Just before the ceremony began, he leaned in close. I respected your rank the night I found out who you actually were, he said quietly. But I've spent the last 4 months respecting the man you chose to be, coat and all. That took longer to learn, and it means more. I put my hand on his shoulder. That's the only promotion that ever really matters, I said. People sometimes ask me whether that dinner changed our family. I think it's the wrong question to ask. That dinner didn't change us. It revealed us, all of us, exactly as we already were. Sitting around a table with an envelope between us and no idea yet what it was going to cost, or teach, or fix. It revealed my daughter's quiet courage, sitting there hurting and still refusing to make a scene. It revealed a father's disappointment in a son who'd absorbed the wrong lessons about what family is supposed to protect. It revealed a young man's pride, dressed up as confidence, standing in for a kind of security he hadn't actually earned yet. And thankfully it also revealed something else, his willingness, once the pride cracked open, to actually grow. Real wealth was never my pension. It wasn't the investment Stacy and I built so carefully over 4 decades. Or the house that's been paid off since before Emily left for college. Real wealth was standing in that small white church, watching 2 families become one, not because anyone had finally proven anything about money, but because the truth had finally been allowed to sit at the table, and once it was there, it made room for something better than pride. Grace, if any part of this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a son-in-law, a father, a daughter caught in the middle, or maybe even a version of yourself sitting quietly at a table while people underestimate you, comment the word strength below and tell me which part hit hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge. We tell stories about the moments that test families and the people who rise to meet them. Hit that bell so you never miss one. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't proving them wrong. It's giving them room to become better.